So if we're going to try to explicate explanation in terms of causation, we need to talk a little bit about the problem of causation in the broader sense. Now, there is no uniform agreed upon account of what cause is. In fact, the logical positivists under influence of David Hume were very much averse to the idea of causation in general. Cause to them seemed again like sort of spooky metaphysics. David Hume's argument against cause is something I covered in a previous lecture, and as a general rule, empiricists have been very wary of causation ever since, due to this very simple fact that, well, we never actually see one event cause another, we simply see one event followed by another, and therefore causation seems like something that we can't have any empirical grasp of. So if we're going to be hardcore empiricists, perhaps we should do away with cause entirely. That's part of the reason why the positivists were attracted to the covering law model in the first place, because it made no appeal to cause. But if we are going to give up on the covering law model, we're going to try to shift towards cause. Maybe we can just sort of say, well, we're not going to be die-hard empiricists, so maybe we're not going to run into the same problem that Hume ran into. People can appeal to intellectual work from people like Immanuel Kant, for example, to try to resuscitate the notion of cause. I'm not going to explore Kant's thinking here, but suffice to say that even non-empiricists are going to have problems explicating exactly what they mean by causation. So, for example, one account of cause tries to unpack cause in terms of counterfactual claims. That is to say that X causes Y if and only if, in the absence of X, Y wouldn't happen, which makes sense for a lot of things like, what caused the explosion? Well, the presence of the gasoline and the lighting of the match caused the explosion. If there was no match and if there was no gasoline, there would have been no explosion. Something like that certainly seems like a fairly straightforward account of cause, but there's other cases where this doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense. If John Wilkes Booth's parents had not given birth to John Wilkes Booth, then John Wilkes Booth never would have assassinated Abraham Lincoln, but it doesn't seem to make sense to say that John Wilkes Booth's parents having John Wilkes Booth as a son is the cause of Abraham Lincoln being assassinated. There seems to be too many steps in between John Wilkes Booth being born and John Wilkes Booth assassinating Abraham Lincoln to say that early first step is a cause. Indeed, if you start painting cause this way, then you're going to see there's the chain of cause actually goes back very, very far in history, such that things that cause contemporary events are actually billions of years old, because if things a billion years ago had gone differently, what happened yesterday wouldn't be happening yesterday. That seems like it's a pretty broad understanding of cause. Even if there's obviously some truth to it, it seems like there's something missing in that kind of account. Other non-empiricist accounts of causation try to explain things in cause in terms of regularity. That is to say that X causes Y if and only if anytime X happens, Y happens. Again, that kind of regularity account certainly makes a certain degree of sense too, but there's going to be some pretty problematic cases in that too, because sometimes it seems like things happen, somewhat only on a statistical basis. They happen, 50% of the time when something occurs, and that's not, again, maybe we can build some sort of statistics into the regularity to account for that, but things are going to start to get pretty complicated there. Now, I'm not saying that these ideas cannot be defended or made more robust. I'm not delving into these and not giving them a full hearing here. I'm just trying to give you the idea that both of these accounts have some pretty serious problems. But however we choose to explicate cause specifically, even if we can sort of agree upon a particular account of what it means for X to cause Y, there's still going to be even more further difficulties unpacking how it is that cause amounts to explanation. The causal account of explanation definitely seems to fit in some cases, but there's other cases where it doesn't seem like it fits terribly well. So there's some instances where all X's there's going to be some cases where you can explain X in terms of a cause and effect, but there's going to be other cases where that's not going to work. So contrary to Aristotle, for example, there are some events which appear to have no cause. Our best current scientific understanding, for example, says that it makes no sense to talk about the cause of the Big Bang. Asking what caused the Big Bang, as the saying goes, is kind of like asking what's north of the North Pole. It's a nonsensical question. There's also quantum behavior, where things don't seem to obey sort of straightforward rules of cause and effect. Again, they seem to be more statistical in nature. But that doesn't mean that astrophysicists and particle physicists can't explain the Big Bang, or they can't explain quantum behavior. Again, many, many dissertations and books and scientific papers have been written explaining these phenomena. They're just not giving a causal explanation. They're giving some sort of different kind of explanation. Another kind of problem is that sometimes saying what causes something actually fails to explain that thing. I might be feeling a deep sense of ennui, a depression that I just can't seem to kick. And a neuroscientist might say, well, the reason why I'm feeling these things is because of some sort of neurochemical imbalance in my brain. Now, that is probably true. Again, if we accept sort of a materialist account of the mind, we understand that there's a relationship between neurochemistry and mood or feeling. It seems like it's a true statement to say that my ennui is caused by a neurochemical imbalance. But that doesn't really seem like a thorough explanation. I mean, it's an explanation of a sort. But it seems like I want something else when I'm trying to sort of talk about my depression. If we take this sort of neuroreductionist approach to feelings or to emotions, then something really important is being left out. So it's not to say that there isn't something to this kind of story. It's just, it's not enough. It is not a complete explanation. What we're looking for, presumably, is a complete explanation. Another problem, of course, goes the other way. Sometimes we can explain something without addressing at all what caused it. So I love old photographs, for instance. In particular, my old photographs from my childhood. I will sometimes seriously spend hours just flipping through old photographs. It brings all sorts of powerful feelings up in me when I do this. And you can explain this by saying that I'm sort of have a nostalgic personality. And I think that's actually quite true. I am very much a nostalgic person. I reflect on my own past quite a lot. And I think that, again, that makes a certain degree of sense. If someone saw me doing this, if I said to them, well, I do this kind of thing because I'm a nostalgic person, that would sort of make sense to them. They would say, okay, yeah, I get that. I can be nostalgic too sometimes. But that doesn't really give a causal account. My nostalgia doesn't cause my love of old photographs. It's associated with my love of old photographs. It's part and parcel of my love of old photographs, or rather my love of old photographs is part and parcel of the fact that I'm nostalgic. So there's no cause and effect going on there. So it seems like we can explain things without ever invoking cause. So long story short, cause is definitely good in some instances when you're looking for an explanation, but it's not so good in others. It's necessary in some instances, but not necessary in others. So all of these, though, do point to an alternative account, which I want to unpack now. And that alternative account is referred to as Unificationism. This might be our third account of explanation. If the first was the covering law model, the second is the cause model, Unificationism can be our third model. According to Unificationism, we explain something when we're trying to explain something that we don't understand. We do that by putting it in terms of something that we do understand. So we bring it under the umbrella, under the auspices of some sort of explanatory schema, is the phrase that's often used here. The point of science is to develop an explanatory schema. And when you can subsume a phenomena under that general schema, you are explaining it, you are accounting for it, you are doing everything that you need to do to make sense of it. And as a general rule in science, as smaller the set of principles that can account for a broader array of phenomena is better. You make scientific advancement when you explain a wide variety of phenomena in terms of a small set of principles. Now, probably the best examples I can think of here are Darwinian evolution and Newtonian mechanics. Darwin manages to explain almost basically every single fact about the biological world using a very small number of premises. You can debate on exactly how many. I think you can probably do it in about 3, maybe 4, something like common descent, descent with modification, and some sort of genetic principle, something along those lines. Again, the details here aren't terribly important. The key thing is just to recognize that a theory of evolution can explain an incredible lot of variety by appealing to a very small number of principles. Ditto for Isaac Newton. One of Isaac Newton's sort of grand insights was the recognition that the same basic sort of fundamental laws could be applied both to terrestrial mechanics and to celestial mechanics. The same reason why a cannonball falls in the arc that it falls is also the same same reason why the moon orbits the Earth. The same laws apply to both. When you can sort of unify those two disparate phenomena under one umbrella, you are doing an awful lot of explanatory work. If you have a good understanding of why it is that apples fall to the Earth, then you have a good understanding of why it is that the Earth orbits the Sun. By connecting those two things, by unifying them, you give an explanation. So something like the unification account allows us to make sense of so-called causeless phenomena, like the Big Bang or quantum behavior. Again, when you read books on astrophysics, when you read books on the Big Bang, when you read books on quantum behavior, and you sort of hunt down the parts where they're trying to explain things, what they try to do is try to put them under a general explanatory schema. Relativity and quantum mechanics are powerful explanatory schema. You can understand an awful lot of phenomena if you simply understand the basic principles of relativity or the basic principles of quantum mechanics. You don't need to invoke cause. You need to simply say, well, this thing kind of works like this thing. This thing works in a similar way to this thing works. It's not sort of pure analogy per se, but it's simply taking something that you understand and showing how that thing that you already understand can be extended further to account for things that you currently don't understand. This is also really good for explaining things like psychological phenomena, like the ennui that I talked about before, or falling in love. We're oftentimes not just looking for sort of neurochemical accounts for these sorts of things, even though again, we may be looking for that. There's nothing wrong with that account. It's just usually not a complete account. We want something that is, as it were, sort of humanistic. We can explain nostalgia or ennui or love in terms of things that other people understand, because other people have been through things like this, even if they maybe not they might not be nostalgic for old photographs perhaps, but they might be nostalgic for their diary or something like that. You can sort of take the one thing and use it to explain the other. Even though you haven't given a cause, you've given someone who you're trying to explain something to a point of reference that they can use to sort of understand where it is that you're coming from. And so the unification account also is really good for this kind of psychological phenomena. But it comes as no surprise, I'm sure, that there are problems with the unification account as well. I think the appeal of the unification account comes from this aha moment, this sort of, oh yeah, that makes sense, I get it. When something clicks like that, when suddenly we understand an unknown phenomena, we put it in terms of an understood principle. This is something that the great teachers sort of can see on a student's face when they see it click, and they go, "Oh, now I get it." Again, the use of the right metaphor or the right case study or the right illustration can really sort of unify things for a student that they didn't understand, and that sort of again that tangible feeling of that aha moment, either if you're feeling it yourself or you're watching it on someone else's face, is something that is definitely rewarding and understood. I think it's something that we can relate to. But at the same time, it's not always clear that this aha moment actually is understanding. Again, I think teachers also can recognize the idea when they see that aha moment on a student's face, only to later realize in an essay or a test that no, it looked like they understood, but in fact they didn't actually understand at all. So to use sort of a straightforward example here, a religious person might try to explain a phenomena by saying, well, it was the will of God. Why was there an earthquake? Why did my dad get cancer? Something like that. For a religious person, the notion that it's the will of God might seem to sort of click under this idea of unificationism. They think they have at least a general understanding of God and God's will. Of course, usually God works in mysterious ways. They don't have a full understanding, but they at least understand that there is a God and that God wills things. God has a plan, even if we can't understand the details of that plan. So for a religious person, saying it was God's will might seem like an explanation. But I think that, even for a religious person, if they are sort of in the least bit sort of self-critical, they're going to recognize that that's not enough. They're going to want more than that. If a deeply religious person finds a dead body murdered on the street, they're not just going to say, well, that was God's will. They're going to want to know who committed the murder. We actually sometimes don't actually serve our interests for explanation by simply appealing to a simplified story. Sometimes, in fact, we need more complexity to explain things, not less. We should not be satisfied with simplistic explanations. Simplifying things might be good, but oversimplifying things is not, and it's really hard to know where to draw that line between simplification and oversimplification. To a certain extent, it kind of seems like we're just falling back on judgment. It's the old line about from the Supreme Court about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I can't define explanation, but I know it when I see it. There's something to that, again, in the sense that we do see, it seems, no explanations when we see it, but we also, of course, can find instances where we thought we explained something that we didn't explain something. So it's not entirely clear how much we should trust our judgment here. Now, in this respect, I think the causation account has a definite advantage, because causal explanations, at least when they are clearly causal explanations, whatever shortcomings they have, a causal explanation is pretty clearly a real explanation. If you have an actual case of cause and effect, you actually have a real explanation. I think this cartoon here from the New Yorker, a fairly famous cartoon, I think in philosopher of science circles, really hits it well. When it comes to unification, it kind of seems like there's a certain amount of hand-waving going on. People just sort of suggest, and then a miracle occurs. Well, it looks like science is going to say we need to be more explicit here in step 2. We can't just sort of take this sort of black box approach where we just say something magical happens and then you have an explanation. Now, whether or not that greater explication is going to come in terms of causation or come in terms of something else is another question entirely. But suffice to say, it does seem like in this respect, cause has advantages over unification, and unification has advantages over causation. So now some of you are probably thinking, well, maybe we can try to have our cake and eat it too. Maybe there's no reason why we have to put all our eggs in one basket. Maybe we can appeal to the covering law model in certain contexts, appeal to causation in other contexts, and appeal to unification in other contexts still. Maybe we don't need a singular account of explanation. Maybe we can have a pluralistic account of explanation. Now, from where I sit, I think there's actually a lot of work in this kind of pluralism in the philosophy of science in recent years. This is one of those things, of course, where the devil is in the details. How do we know which version of explanation to appeal to in which contexts? There's a lot of fine-grained detail work that can be done and has been done, I think, in recent decades in the philosophy of science over trying to sort of figure out a way to integrate these things. And one person who's done a lot of work in this actually is Peter Godfrey-Smith, again, who wrote the textbook that I'm using for this lecture series. Peter Godfrey-Smith holds to a view that he refers to as contextualism, which says that a good explanation is at least somewhat dependent on the specific context. So a humanistic explanation might be very different than a scientific explanation. And an explanation in biology might be very different than an explanation in physics. So rather than trying to find sort of a single uniform understanding of what explanation is, we should understand that explanation, like so many things, is context sensitive. Whether or not something is an explanation and whether or not something is a good explanation depends on the context in which it's being offered. Another contextualist actually is Bos van Fraassen, who I talked about in the previous lecture. Bos van Fraassen is also a contextualist, but for different reasons than Peter Godfrey-Smith is. Van Fraassen's account of explanations is a somewhat of a deflationary one. He says basically that an explanation is any answer to a why question. Any answer that a person gives to the question why X, Y, Z, why this, why that, why the other. Any answer that a person gives is an explanation. So it's a very permissive account. Now, again, just because something is an explanation doesn't necessarily mean it's a good explanation. But as long as at least one person out there says that this answers your why question, that, at least for that one person, is going to qualify as an explanation. So for Van Fraassen, explanation is not located in science. There's nothing sort of particular about science that gives it any particular explanatory power or explanatory account. Rather, explanation for him is a linguistic phenomenon. It happens in the level on what linguistics refer to as the pragmatics of a sentence. Whether or not X explains Y, or whether or not that's a satisfactory explanation of Y, depends entirely on what the person saying X explains Y is trying to do with that sentence. What they are trying to make sense of, and to what extent they're trying to make sense of it, is going to have all the difference in the world. So when someone asks, why did X happen? Again, why did the car explode? What they usually mean is, why did X happen rather than Y happen? Why did the car explode rather than it not explode? Jeffrey Kasser, a philosopher of science I've mentioned in previous lectures, gives an excellent example here about the line from the bank robber Willie Sutton. Someone asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? And his famous answer is, well, because that's where the money is. It sort of seems like a no-brainer. Willie Sutton wanted the money. That's where the money was. That's what he robbed. So again, the humor there comes from the disconnect between, again, the question that Sutton thought he was being asked: why do you rob banks rather than the Boy Scouts, for example? Well, Boy Scouts don't have money. The bank does. But of course, what the person was really trying to get Sutton to answer was not why do you rob banks rather than the Boy Scouts. What he was trying to get them to answer was why do you rob banks rather than having a day job, rather than making an honest living. So when Sutton's answer, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. That's not a good explanation, because Sutton was answering the wrong question. He was answering, why do you rob banks rather than the Boy Scouts? What he was being asked was, why do you rob banks rather than work an honest job? So, again, you can see why the pragmatics come in here. Whether or not an answer is a good explanation depends on the specific question that's actually being asked. And sometimes we need to spell out not simply, why did X happen? We need to say, why X rather than Y. So for von Fraassen, a good answer to a why question depends on which why question is being asked and by whom it is being asked. Now, if you're trying to explain quantum mechanics to a 5-year-old, you're going to have to give a very different explanation than the kind of explanation that you're giving if you're giving it to a doctoral student in physics. Which is going to be different than the kind of explanation that you're giving if you're trying to give an explanation to maybe a undergraduate philosophy student. Whether or not your explanation is a good explanation depends on who is giving the explanation, who is asking for what is specifically to be explained, and who the person that's trying to make sense of that explanation. All of this context matters if you're trying to assess whether or not you have an explanation and how good that explanation is. So then, going back to that sort of core question of does science explain? Von Fraassen's answer to this question is that science does not by itself explain anything. And when you call a particular explanation scientific, simply means that you're using scientific terminology, scientific ideas, scientific theories to answer a why question. Why am I depressed? Well, if you give the neurochemical explanation for that question, then you're saying that that's a scientific explanation. If you're giving a humanistic one, like you're lost in thought, or you have too much time on your hands, something like that, that's not a scientific explanation, but it might be a perfectly legitimate answer to the why question, depending on who's asking the question and what they're trying to get out of it. In this respect, explanation for von Fraassen really is kind of like technology. You can use science to provide technology, but using technology is not the same as doing science, and doing science doesn't always necessarily involve technology. There's a clear relationship between technology and science, but they're not isomorphic, they're not the same thing. Ditto for explanation. Explanation is something which can be scientific, but doesn't necessarily need to be scientific. Scientific work can explain, but it doesn't necessarily need to explain. Now, there's an obvious problem here for some people that this kind of seems like it's an invitation to relativism. Who gets to decide what is a good answer to a why question is very much relative. Again, go back to the religious person. For a religious person, or a certain variety of religious person at least, it was God's will. Seems like a perfectly legitimate answer to why you got cancer, why someone had to die prematurely, why is there a universe. That it's God's will, for some people at least, seems perfectly satisfactory. A lot of hard-nosed scientific realists want to say that that's not a good answer. Von Fraassen seems to have to admit that, well, just so long as they accept it, then it's a good answer. And again, I think von Fraassen quite clearly bites the bullet on this one. He just says explanation is always explanation to someone. The second you have someone who is satisfied with a given sentence, genuinely satisfied, you have a sufficient explanation for that person. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be satisfactory to another person, but he's perfectly willing to accept relativism here. Each and every individual gets to decide for themselves whether or not a given explanation is actually an explanation. So I think it makes sense here to say a little bit about the notion of inference to the best explanation. This is an old notion, sometimes called abductive argument, and this is something which ties in very closely, of course, to the notion of explanation, because it's an argumentative tool which sometimes applies. If we might have multiple different accounts, multiple different explanations that are technically all compatible with the evidence that we have, but we want to make the inference to the best explanation. So if we find a dead body with a bullet hole in their head, or what looks like a bullet hole, we might come to we might explain, say that there was someone shot them, or we might say that their brain spontaneously combusted in a way that just mimics the appearance of a bullet hole. It's pretty clear to most people the best explanation in that case is going to be that the person was shot. But of course, that kind of situation is pretty clear. Which is the best explanation in a lot of cases are not going to quite be so clear. Sometimes, for example, the order in which you present the data is actually might influence whether or not a particular person thinks that the explanation A is better or explanation B is better. Peter Godfrey-Smith uses the term explanatory inference here. He uses this term, I think, specifically to avoid problems with the word best. He likes the notion of explanatory inference because he's not suggesting that any particular explanation is the best explanation or that there is some sort of single metric of quality for an explanation. Rather, we make an explanatory inference when we want to sort of set aside certain kinds of explanations, certain classes of explanations, and focus on certain other classes, not because they are the best per se, but simply because we have a certain criteria that we may or may not explicitly spell out that says these are the better explanations and these are the worse explanations. Now, how we assess an explanation in physics on this account might be very, very different than how we assess an explanation in history. An inference to the best explanation in physics, and again, quantum physics oftentimes appeals to these sorts of arguments when we're trying to adjudicate between, say, the many worlds hypothesis versus the Copenhagen interpretation, for example. Oftentimes, physicists can get involved in debates, and they might appeal to this sort of explanatory inference model. And the kinds of tools that physicists use might be very, very different than the kinds of tools that historians use. Again, if a historian is trying to answer the question, why did the American Civil War happen? Again, that's obviously a complicated question. The best explanation, again, might not be clear, but we might be able to sort of rule out certain kinds of explanations. For example, I think an explanation that says, well, it wasn't about slavery, it was just about state sovereignty or states' rights, something like that. That's, to my mind, admittedly enough, I'm not a historian, so I might be the best person to weigh in here. But at least at face value, I don't think that kind of explanation is going to be a very good explanation. An explanation of the American Civil War is going to have to at least make some reference to slavery, it seems to me. But now you notice, though, again, the key thing here is that kind of process is going to be very, very different than differing interpretations of quantum mechanics. Ditto for things like psychology and biology. The schema that we use to make sense of explanations, to say that this kind of explanation is better than that kind of explanation, might be very different in biology than it is in economics or sociology or psychology or history or physics. So this kind of contextualism here, again, which Godfrey-Smith argues for, is something that allows a lot of permissiveness. It allows sort of 1,000 flowers to bloom. We don't have to sort of reduce all accounts of explanation to a single story about explanation. We don't have to reduce what it means to be a better or the best explanation in one field and then have to apply that to other fields. Now, this kind of contextualism, again, it has its obvious advantages, but there's also, again, as usual, there's going to be problems here. Explanation, it seems like it's a pretty important feature of science for a lot of scientists. Again, there was a time, I think, again, in the days of Newton, where explanation could be sort of done away with, but I think those days are past. It seems to me, at least, that there has to be some talk about the nature of explanation in order to fully make sense of science. This is something that science does, whether we like it or not, so it behooves us to try to make sense of exactly how science does this. But if we accept this kind of contextualism, then that sort of starts pushing us in a direction that science actually might not really be a thing at all. There might not really be a unified thing that we can refer to as science. The suggestion here seems to be that there really is no such thing as science per se. Rather, what you have is a bunch of fractured disciplines. Psychology, biology, chemistry, physics, if they aren't appealing to an underlying unified set of principles, like a principle about what amounts for explanation, then that suggests that maybe it's a mistake actually to refer to them all under this umbrella term of science. Maybe there really is no such thing as science at all. Rather, what you have is a bunch of different fields, like physics and chemistry and biology, which don't all play by the same rules. So, I mean, this is going to be particularly the case if we find that there's going to be incommensurability between different fields. If biology's account of the world does not mesh with physics' account of the world, if what physics tells us about the nature of the world is in some important sense fundamentally different than the story that we get from biology, or, for example, if the story that we get from psychology is fundamentally different than the story that we get from biology or the story that we get from physics, it kind of seems like we might end up having some deeply, deeply incommensurable stories here. Think about the old debate between free will and determinism, right? You know, the determinism debate says, the side of the debate basically says, look, physics is so powerful, the behavior of all matter has to be determined by the laws of physics, therefore we have no free will. Whereas the free will people appeal to phenomenology, they appeal to psychology, they appeal to to criminal justice, and sort of suggesting that all of these things don't make any sense at all if we don't have free will. Now, again, my point here is not to rehash the free will determinism debate. Obviously, it's a huge debate. I'm not meaning to get into it now. The point is just to suggest here that the kind of incommensurability that you get between the free will side of the debate and the determinism side of the debate, that might end up being a model for what we see across the sciences if we embrace contextualism. We might get stories from one branch of science which is just fundamentally incompatible with the stories that we get from a different branch of science. And if that's the case, then maybe it doesn't make sense anymore to talk about the scientific point of view or a scientific worldview. Maybe rather we have to start recognizing that chemists and biologists and physicists are fundamentally doing different kinds of things, at least when it comes to explanation. And if that's what they're doing, then we have real worries about how exactly we reconcile these disciplines to one another, and that's something that makes a lot of people very, very nervous.